that we are a big umbrella, a radical, somewhat loudmouth umbrella.
1, 2, 3, 4, we are marching.
Were it not for people like us, slavery might still be legal, children would be working in sweatshops in this country as well as around the world, which does still continue. Women wouldn't be voting, gay and lesbian people would still be in the closet. It's not about leaders making decisions, it's not about government officials, it's about what grassroots people like ourselves do.
The Peace Council, dedicatedly nonviolent, they are dedicated to bringing about an economic system and a social system which better meets the needs of the human race and also values other living things.
It changed my life completely. There's no doubt about that. I think getting involved with a bunch of people who had a structured way to address the problems of this country, problems in our society, made all the difference in the world to me.
They're not afraid to ruffle feathers. You need people who are willing to go out on a limb. The Peace Council is willing to say exactly the way it is.
The Syracuse Peace Council, founded in 1936,
is an anti-war social justice organization.
It's the community-based,
autonomous, and funded by the contributions of its supporters.
SPC educates,
agitates, and organizes
for a world where war,
violence, and exploitation in any form
will no longer exist.
The Syracuse Peace Council is both an organization and part of broader movements for peace and social justice. SPC acts independently and in concert with other organizations or in support of their initiatives.
We are the oldest continuously running local peace and justice organization in the country. There have always been people in the ups and the downs who have said, if this thing died, we'd have to create it. So doesn't it make much more sense to do what we can to hang on by our fingernails and to make sure it doesn't die?
There were people who had been holding it together with duct tape and love and strength and caring, and then 9/11/01 happened, and from that came the desire to revitalize the Peace Council.
My first rally was against the war in Iraq, and it was very much exciting to me to stand up for something I truly believe in.
In the fall of 2002, where we had 5 separate marches that converged downtown for a large rally in front of the Armory that drew about 1,000 people. And certainly that was a tremendous moment, to look out at that crowd and just see this sea of people really representing various parts of the central New York community. And that was also at a moment where we held on to some hope that we might prevent the war with Iraq.
I'd really like to thank the Syracuse Peace Council for asking me to come down this evening to join you, to talk about what we might do to end this brutal war against the people of Iraq.
I spent 5 months in Iraq before the U.S. invasion, during the entire invasion, and also after the invasion during the occupation. And while I was in Iraq, I was wearing, my Peace Council hat because I was kind of the Peace Newsletter's foreign correspondent.
I see obvious connections between what's happening in Iraq, what's happening in terms of issues of economic globalization and the U.S. military presence globally.
If you think about today, we're facing a terrible, terrible administration, and I see almost the face of fascism in this organization that's in control of our country today. We see a terrible war that's going on that had no justification at all, built upon lies and deceit. We see poverty of tremendous numbers that are not justified. We see a real gap between the rich and the poor getting worse and worse.
Step by step, the longest march can be won, can be won. Many stones to form an arch, singly none, singly none. This nation was born claiming to honor certain ideals: freedom, equality, and democracy. Given U.S. genocide targeting Native Americans, given the legalization of slavery, given frequent illegal U.S. military interventions and invasions abroad, and given an election process corrupted by corporate financing, those ideals are more often invoked than implemented. We struggle to honor those ideals. Some might define such work as patriotism.
So what we have to do is to consolidate that work of exposing the lies and continue to promote the ideas of dismantling the Pentagon's expenditure of billions of dollars when there are no books for schools, when 40 million citizens do not have health care, and when the infrastructure of the country is deteriorating.
From the boarding schools that my grandparents were forced to attend, the history that we're taught in schools, there's a big difference. We're told that the founding fathers were so fair and almost saintly, but they were slave owners and they were genocidal. They stole land from the Indians, they killed Indians. And those things have never been addressed completely. I think that a lot of the things going on in the world today kind of stem from the fact that these things happened, and also that they've never been dealt with in any real level.
And that's one of the things that's always been important to me about the Peace Council, and really about all of my activist work, that being part of a long legacy, a historic tradition of people who saw that war was wrong, who saw these terrible injustices in our nation, and did what we could to try and change that.
The Syracuse Peace Council was founded as part of the Emergency Peace Campaign, a nationwide effort that rode a wave of anti-war sentiment based on the horrors of World War I. SPC was one of only 6 such groups to survive World War II. In 1936, SPC sold over $1,500 worth of peace bonds, ranking Syracuse second among all cities nationwide. 21 organizations affiliated, with the mayor of Syracuse and his wife heading the list of 24 individual sponsors. By 1937, SPC produced a weekly radio show, a monthly peace newsletter, the PNL, mailed to some 1,600 people, a monthly discussion bulletin, educational forums, study groups, and 4 standing committees. On December 8, 1941, 2 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the SPC Executive Committee sent a telegram to Congress urging calm and deliberate consideration. 10 days later, SPC founder Norman Whitney wrote in the Peace Newsletter, "A major objective of our effort through the years has failed. Our beloved country is at war." He continued, during the war, the Peace Council would be ministering to the civilian suffering caused by war, striving to mitigate the interracial hatreds and intolerance such are bound to arise in times of national excitement, and guarding jealously the constitutional, civil, and religious liberties for which America stands. The war years have been devoted almost exclusively to refugees, relief, and the counseling of conscientious objectors, wrote longtime SPC worker Adelaide Webster.
There were a lot of people who were involved in the movement for peace and justice issues, civil rights issues after World War II. We thought we were going to have a wonderful, wonderful world, and yet we didn't have this wonderful, wonderful world. But we kept struggling for it, And there were those of us who kept opposing the wars that this country has been engaged in.
We live in a world that's in desperate straits. We live in a country that's desperately betrayed its own values, and we need to turn that around.
If our government is going around to war every time something happens, then we're telling to the world, or we're telling to our kids also, we're the bully here, and if you're stronger, you can bully anyone.
I want to go back to a photograph that was taken of me at a peace march, anti-war march, actually anti-Korean war march. And I was pregnant with my first child, very, very pregnant. And I had a poster that said, "I want this child to grow up, not blow up."
The growing menace of communism arouses the House of Representatives Un-American Activities Committee. Among the well-informed witnesses testifying is J. Edgar Hoover, head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Yeah, this is a dossier sent to me by the FBI, which has about 170 pages to it, and that is offensive and shocking to be regarded as an enemy. And I like to say that, you know, I consider myself such a gentle person. I even cry at basketball games, so it's hard for me to think of myself as some kind of a disloyal enemy, so to speak.
In 1964, the SBC held a 24-hour vigil in downtown Syracuse, ending at noon on Thanksgiving Day. SBC members stood in front of the Christmas tree on Clinton Square. The leaflet they handed out to passers-by read in part, "By the time it takes you to read this leaflet, 35 people will have died from starvation. In the same time, the U.S. will have spent $500,000 for bombs, missiles, and other armaments."
This was during a period where the anti-war movement grew rather rapidly. When I was first involved with the Peace Council, I remember we had a weekly vigil in downtown on Salina Street. I remember standing there by myself with a sign. And just a few years later, there were 4,000 people standing along the sides of the street. Now, we didn't get 4,000 people out every time.
During the Vietnam War era, anti-war activism nationally and locally intensified. 20 committees, many from various Syracuse neighborhoods, worked with the Peace Council. At the height of activity, the Peace Council employed 5 full-time staff people, and for the first time owned its own office, a small house on Burnett Avenue. In June 1970, the Peace newsletter expanded from a single sheet to its current magazine format. Also during this era, the annual Plowshares Crafts Fair and the annual Peace Calendar, now published by the Syracuse Cultural Workers but originally published by the Peace Council, were initiated.
Culture work really provides the heart and soul and passion in many ways of movement and activist work. It's a gift in a sense that the people who do this work make to changing the world. Culture work also inspires people to continue doing the work or to begin doing work that will change the world.
I remember one march that started from up at the university, came down the hill and into the downtown Syracuse. And I looked back and saw the long line of people. Some of them were carrying candles. And it's something that sticks in my mind as being a fabulous feeling that there was all of this feelings that by young people, older people, everyone was together on this. It was a very, very good moment.
I was in prison for 2 years, 1967 and 68 for draft resistance.
The year was 1967, Andy, and I recall that very clearly because my brother Phil, and during that year, with 3 other men, invaded a draft board in Baltimore and poured blood on the draft files. And so that turned Carol and me very thoughtful about him. And so we began thinking seriously about peace. and of course naturally gravitated toward the Peace Council.
While SPC is an independent organization, during the Vietnam War as well as at other times, SPC has worked with many other organizations and considers itself part of a national and international movement for peace and social justice.
There was no part of life that wasn't spoken to with the progressive politics of the Peace Council community. And certainly the 70s was the time of the women's movement, the beginning of the gay liberation, the beginning of the food co-op here in Syracuse. I was a part of that, the beginning of the credit union where we're taking charge of our money.
War and militarism have wide-reaching causes and contributing factors, so that poverty is a peace issue, racism is a peace issue, sexism is a peace issue, environmentalism is a peace issue.
The Peace Council is very simple, very basic idea of a group of people who are going to be, who are adaptable to different circumstances and new crises that come along. And it's a place where you can walk in and say, okay, let's address this problem.
The Peace Newsletter is the Syracuse Peace Council's public voice.
I think that's been its most important function, is to say to the local community and beyond to some extent, here's another way to look at what you're reading about in the daily paper or you're hearing about on the mainstream press. There are other views. Keep in mind that the P&L was serving that function for many, many, many years before there was the internet.
If our social studies teachers were reading the Peace Council newsletter, instead of listening to the very conservative radio stations, I think we would be doing much better work. So I think we have to work harder at ensuring that we broaden our base.
I'm very proud of the Peace Council's long historic relationship with the traditional government and people at Onondaga, and have worked very actively in terms of the land rights action and our Neighbors of the Onondaga Nation project. And my hope is that that can set a precedent for redressing other crimes that have been committed by our nation regarding slavery, regarding occupation of other nations, etc.
In 1983, we hosted a tour of hibakusha from Japan. They're survivors of Hiroshima. And we brought them not only into the city of Syracuse, but to the Onondaga Nation. And I always felt that this cross-cultural event was one of the most changing times because people were meeting people and learning about the suffering of each other. And then in a very nonverbal way, the Onondaga drummers were joined by Japanese drummers who had been brought in along with the hibakusha, and we had a drumming circle in the social longhouse of the Onondaga Nation.
We cannot have a serious peace movement that is not built on anti-racism. And anti-racism cannot be a slogan. It cannot be something that you say on the platform without internalizing an understanding of the crimes that were committed in the past and how those crimes are committed in the present.
Until the last train falls, war will make slaves of us all. So if you want peace, work for justice. If you want peace, work for justice. If you want peace, work for justice. No justice, no peace.
I think an area that we have not done as well as we need to is connecting to communities of people of color. And that when we relocated the Plowshares Crafts Fair from Plymouth downtown to the Southwest Community Center, that was a very purposeful move. We were desirous of connecting in a much more real way to people of color, both as crafters and as people who would come to Plowshares as visitors, as buyers. And there was a mixed success about that. We're now at Nottingham High School, and the Peace Council continues working to make Plowshares truly reflect the diversity of our community.
Peace Council give me that avenue also to educate people about my religion, about my community, and also about the outside world, because I came from a different country and I could relate to some of the people over there.
The changes in the 70s were very pronounced because it had been a very male-dominated, hierarchical organization up until then. Very good people, but the women's movement particularly brought in a sense of inclusion and decision-making by everyone.
The Peace Council at that time and ever since has very strongly supported gay rights. Even when maybe that was losing it, maybe some support in the community. But I really respected that.
It's not the job of women to stop rape. It's not the job of people of color to end racism. It's the job of all of us as allies to end injustice. And so we all have to get involved to take care of each other.
I remember their attempts to stop the production of nuclear weapons and to stop the building of nuclear power plants.
I think the Peace Council played a significant role in stopping the continued spread of nuclear power plants in upstate New York in the mid to late 70s.
I will always remember William Sunderland actually explaining to the press in a press conference the differences in nuclear power reactors and what reactor was at 3 Mile Island versus what was being built up in Oswego. And here was a sense where we were not only able to convey the dangers and the risks, but we were actually the technical advisors to the press. I do remember going to the Syracuse Common Council and describing to them the risks of nuclear waste being transported through the city, and to have been taken very seriously by the Common Council as the people who knew the best what those risks were.
Because of my ongoing interaction with the Peace Council, I felt more and more that I had to bring my activism into my professional life. And I completely changed my career so that my doctorate is in American Literature and Cultural Studies, and my specialty is in representations of war.
I think we have to realize and imagine what the consequences would have been if after the numerous invasions, the show of power, the denial of social justice, if the Peace Council and other groups hadn't been there, if the government and the corporations, whoever was transgressing, had unbridled power and wasn't checked.
How governments lie to their people and how nations are driven to war. There are shadows on the faces of the men who fan the flame. To those wars that are fought in places where their business interests run.
The Peace Council has regularly celebrated its birthday, from the first in 1937 through today, serving as educational events and to build community among Peace Council supporters. Speakers have included Amy Goodman, Orrin Lyons and Audrey Shenandoah, Phil Berrigan and Molly Rush, Noam Chomsky, Howard Zinn, and musicians such as folk singer Tom Paxton.
I have remained an activist throughout my life, which I feel that the Peace Council years were, very strong in solidifying my commitments to peace and social justice.
I don't know if my actions are going to make a difference, but I know that my inaction would leave things the same. So I'm taking a chance that my actions, magnified by others, will end up making a difference.
It's like the stone being thrown in the pond. You may not get the first wave, but eventually it's going to get to your shore.
Peace Council has given me many of my dearest friends and most valuable memories. I am tremendously grateful.
I always have to be alert to the fact that my grandson will have to face this. And I don't want that for him any more than I want it for your son or for mine or for an Iraq son.
Some of the most meaningful and powerful moments of my life have been while I'm engaged in social action with fellow people working for peace and social justice.
The work is, and I'm not a religious person, The work is holy. The work is why we are here.
Join hands with the peace-loving nation. I am no doctor, but if I was one, I would inject new blood down in Washington. But I am a bleeder, and what's my blood for? But to flood the engines of war, like a plowshare, like Martin Luther King, like Kathy Kelly, like Buffy St. Marie.